If you believe Sean Strickland and Khamzat Chimaev are ready to kill each other before the cage door even locks, you are falling for the oldest illusion in combat sports. Fight week for UFC 328 has descended into a state of highly publicized, suffocating panic. The headlines dominating the combat sports landscape right now are no longer concerned with the intricacies of grappling exchanges or the geometry of striking range. Instead, the narrative has been entirely consumed by an escalating, volatile hostility between the two men anchoring the card. There is a continuous barrage of verbal artillery. There are explicit threats of violence that stretch far beyond the confines of a sanctioned bout. The tension has accelerated to a velocity where the promotion itself is reportedly stepping on the brakes. According to widespread coverage leading up to the event, UFC officials are actively weighing the unprecedented decision to cancel the traditional pre-fight face-off. They are terrified. In the brutal economics of mixed martial arts, the staredown is not merely a photo opportunity for the press. It is a vital psychological battleground. It is the crescendo of promotional friction, designed to extract the maximum amount of anticipation from the paying audience. The UFC machine thrives on this exact brand of manufactured and organic conflict. Yet, right now, the executives navigating the back channels are looking at Strickland and Chimaev and realizing they might be holding a lit match over a powder keg. They are calculating the financial value of that final, tense stare-down against the catastrophic risk of a chaotic, unsanctioned brawl erupting on a theatrical stage. Canceling a face-off is a rare and desperate maneuver. It is an acknowledgement from the promotion that the psychological guardrails, keeping the athletes within the realm of a regulated sport, have entirely collapsed. When the organizing body decides that two professional fighters cannot be trusted to stand a few feet apart for 10 seconds, it sends a profound signal about the instability of the situation. To understand the gravity of this, you have to observe the behavioral patterns of the fighters involved. Strickland has meticulously cultivated a brand of chaotic, unfiltered unpredictability, transforming every media obligation into an actively hostile environment. Chimaev, conversely, draws his aura from an image of absolute, relentless dominance and an unwavering refusal to back down. Both men are currently trapped in the gravitational pull of their own intimidating personas. When two unyielding egos of this magnitude are forced into proximity, conceding even a fraction of an inch is treated as a fatal psychological surrender. This is the reality of the situation on the ground, but we also must account for the biological reality of what these athletes are enduring. Fight week is a uniquely torturous chamber. It is defined by severe caloric restriction and rapid, dangerous dehydration. It is characterized by chronic sleep deprivation, compounded by the blinding lights of cameras and the repetitive antagonistic questioning from a media apparatus desperate for a viral moment. The fighters walking through those hotel lobbies are physically deteriorating, yet neurologically redlined. Their nervous systems are completely frayed. When you place two hyper-competitive men in this physiological crucible and implicitly demand that they maintain their impenetrable armor for the cameras, the byproduct is the explosive, uncontrollable hostility we are currently witnessing. The audience consumes this aggression at face value. The media amplifies it as an authentic desire for immediate bloodshed. Everyone is talking about the bad blood. They look at the looming cancellation of the face-off and conclude that this is pure, unadulterated hatred. They believe the violence simply cannot wait for the referee's signal inside the octagon. But according to a man who has lived under that exact pressure, that is not what is happening here. Enter Dominick Cruz, a former UFC bantamweight champion, a veteran of the highest-stakes title fights in the history of the sport, and a man who understands the neurological toll of championship week better than almost anyone breathing. Cruz is currently observing this spectacle not as a casual spectator, but as an analyst diagnosing a psychological condition. While the public sees a burgeoning blood feud, Cruz sees the unmistakable reflection of pressure. He recently pointed out a critical dynamic that has been largely ignored by the mainstream coverage: the escalating hostility, the threats, the absolute refusal to de-escalate. These are not organic hatreds, but rather the desperate byproducts of the agonizing stress inherent to the final days before a massive pay-per-view. Both Chimaev and Strickland have meticulously built their entire commercial identities on being the most abrasive, uncompromising individuals in any room they enter. They are trapped in their own branding. Neither man can afford to be the one who blinks. Neither man can afford to look subservient. especially not during the most heavily scrutinized week of their professional lives. When Strickland looks at Chimaev, he sees a reflection of the exact same unyielding stubbornness that he relies on. It becomes a toxic feedback loop of ego. If one steps forward, the other must step forward harder. If one raises his voice, the other must scream. It is a high-stakes game of psychological chicken, where swerving is simply not an option. The sheer weight of maintaining that facade, while physically starving and mentally exhausted, forces them into a corner where extreme aggression is the only acceptable response. The media portrays this escalating conflict as an insatiable thirst for combat. That is not a desire for violence. That is a psychological defense mechanism. What we are witnessing is a performance. It is an exhausting attempt to maintain the armor. When you are facing a terrifying opponent, when the entire world is dissecting your every move, and when your body is screaming for sustenance, the mind builds walls. For Strickland and Chimaev, those walls are constructed with violent rhetoric and unpredictable behavior. They are engaging in this relentless verbal warfare not necessarily to intimidate each other, but to prove their own grit to themselves. They are projecting an aura of absolute danger, to drown out the inherent vulnerability of stepping into a locked cage. They are wearing an armor of words, because the alternative showing even a flicker of doubt. A momentary lapse in the tough guy persona is viewed in the fight game as a terminal weakness. Dominick Cruz recognizes this cycle not because he read it in a textbook, but because it is the fundamental currency of elite mixed martial arts. The bravado is always directly proportional to the underlying stakes. The hostility is the only shield they have left against the crushing anxiety of fight week. And that is exactly why the UFC is terrified of putting them in the same room. In 2014, the UFC learned a very expensive lesson regarding the combustion point of human ego. Picture the media day for UFC 178. Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier, two of the most dominant and prideful forces in the history of the sport, were placed on a stage and asked to simply look each other in the eye. It took less than 3 seconds for the psychological pressure to detonate. A minor closing of distance escalated into a physical shove, which immediately devolved into a chaotic, stage-destroying brawl that sent promotional executives tumbling backward through the sponsor banner. It was a visceral, chaotic reminder that when you put two violently proud men in a confined space and demand they exert dominance, the results cannot be contained by men in suits. The executives sitting in the boardroom today are looking at the escalating, unhinged hostility between Strickland and Chimaev, and they are seeing the ghost of Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier staring back at them. They are terrified of history repeating itself. They are calculating the catastrophic risk of a multi-million-dollar pay-per-view main event being abruptly canceled because someone slipped and tore a ligament during a promotional scuffle, or because a state athletic commission decides to step in and suspend them before the cage doors ever open. But while the promotion's fear is entirely rooted in logistics, liability, and revenue, there is a much deeper psychological mechanism at play here. The media is framing this potential cancellation as a penalty. Everyone is talking about the cancellation as a necessary, heavy-handed security measure to control two uncontrollable savages. Nobody is talking about what it actually is. It is a bailout. By floating the idea of removing the face-off from the schedule, the UFC is not merely protecting its financial investment. They are actively, perhaps unknowingly, rescuing Sean Strickland and Khamzat Chimaev from the inescapable prison of their own performance. Both fighters have accelerated their hostile rhetoric to an absolute point of no return. They have painted themselves into a psychological corner where any attempt at de-escalation, any momentary softening of their posture, would be publicly interpreted as pure cowardice. If they are forced to stand on that stage, toe-to-toe under the flashing lights, the invisible rules of their heavily cultivated personas dictate that they cannot simply stand still. The armor demands action. If Strickland remains stoic and quiet, he risks looking intimidated by the suffocating aura of the undefeated Chechen. If Chimaev simply glares without imposing physical aggression, he risks looking hesitant against the famously aggressive American. They have constructed a scenario where they are practically obligated to initiate physical contact before the weigh-ins even conclude, purely to protect their respective brands. Neither man actually wants to jeopardize their championship opportunity. Neither man truly wants to risk their fight purse, face severe legal repercussions, or derail their career trajectory over a meaningless, unsanctioned scuffle in street clothes. Yet, the immense gravity of their own egos will not allow them to simply stand down and play the role of the quiet professional. Therefore, the cancellation of the staredown is the ultimate, unspoken lifeline. It provides both camps with an ironclad, external excuse to avoid the explosive confrontation they both secretly dread. They get to walk away pointing the finger at the promoter, blaming the UFC for robbing the fans of the violence. They get to maintain the carefully constructed facade of absolute, murderous intent without ever having to actually cash the check their mouths have been writing all week. The UFC is saving them from themselves. The generous reading of this entire situation is that the UFC is simply acting as a responsible promoter, protecting their main event investment from an unpredictable and potentially disastrous physical altercation. The cold reality, however, is far more clinical and deeply rooted in the physiological torment of championship fight week. We look at these two men, Sean Strickland and Khamzat Chimaev, and we see the aggressive posturing, the relentless insults, and the constant threat of violence. We interpret that as a surplus of energy and a surplus of malice. That is not a surplus of anything. That is a system operating in the absolute red. Think about what a professional fighter's body is subjected to in the 96 hours leading up to the moment they are supposed to stand on that stage. They are undergoing a brutal process of rapid dehydration, actively stripping their own organs of vital fluids just to hit a contracted number on a digital scale. They are enduring chronic sleep deprivation, lying awake in hotel rooms with their metabolisms crashing and their anxiety spiking. Every time they step out of their room, they are hit with the blinding flashes of cameras and forced to answer the exact same antagonistic questions from a media apparatus that is entirely detached from the physical suffering occurring right in front of them. Their nervous systems are not just frayed, they are actively failing. When you take a human being and strip away their food, their water, and their sleep, while simultaneously maximizing the psychological pressure placed upon their shoulders, their primal instincts take over. The aggression we are seeing from both Strickland and Chimaev is not calculated intimidation. It is the desperate, uncontrollable scream of a central nervous system that is completely overloaded. They are lashing out because their bodies have been pushed into a state of absolute, unyielding survival mode. The armor is cracking under the weight of the cut. To demand that they stand inches apart, to stare into the eyes of the man who is actively trying to take their livelihood, and to maintain a composed, stoic demeanor while their biology is screaming for relief is an absurd expectation. The UFC's consideration to pull the face off is a rare moment of acknowledging this biological limit. It is an admission that the promotional theater has finally collided with the harsh, unforgiving wall of human endurance. The hostility is no longer a marketing tool. It is a severe liability. The tragedy of Fight Week is that the closer these men get to the actual combat, the less control they have over their own emotional outputs. Strickland's unfiltered chaos and Chimaev's stoic menace are both personas that require immense cognitive energy to maintain. But cognitive energy requires calories, hydration, and rest, the very three things they are currently denied. Therefore, what we are witnessing is the slow, public collapse of their carefully constructed barriers. They are not acting like monsters because they are fearless. They are acting like monsters because they are stripped down to their most vulnerable, animalistic state. The cancellation of the UFC 328 face-off is a temporary ceasefire in a war of attrition that has been waged entirely in the minds of these two athletes. By keeping Sean Strickland and Khamzat Chimaev separated, the promotion has successfully preserved the financial viability of their main event, but they have absolutely not resolved the underlying psychological crisis. They have merely delayed the inevitable moment where the performance must finally end and the brutal reality of the sport must begin. When that Octagon door finally locks on fight night, the dynamic completely shifts. There are no more media obligations. There are no more press conferences to hide behind, no executives to separate them, and there is absolutely no more psychological armor left to wear. All of the manufactured hostility, all of the desperate, unyielding posturing born from the agonizing combination of dehydration and anxiety, will instantly evaporate under the arena lights. What remains will not be two invincible monsters who simply despise each other. What remains will be two exhausted, highly vulnerable athletes forced to finally confront the reality they have been screaming over all week. The real fight is not about who throws the heavier right hand. It is about whose psychological barrier completely collapses first when the referee steps out of the way. Tell me in the comments what you actually think. Are you buying the narrative of genuine, unadulterated hatred between two violent men? Or are we simply watching two fighters slowly cracking under the immense, Suffocating pressure of a championship fight week. Come back to this video on Sunday morning, after the pay-per-view concludes, and look closely at the body language of the man who lost. Because the psychological cracks we are seeing right now, in the lobbies and on the microphones, are going to be the exact reason someone falls inside that cage. If this kind of combat analysis is what you come here for, hit subscribe. We don't just watch the knockouts. We analyze the minds that create them.